Tac. Test for the captioning, test for the captioning. 1, 2, 3.
إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для обеспечения полного и качественного устного перевода необходимо поступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excellences, distingués collègues.
Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I call to order this meeting of the Human Rights Council.
About this, but as I'm the only one on the panel, I decided for the rest of this session, in light of the intense heat wave, to make a slight change in my dress code. Those who would like to follow me are happy or invited to do so. Those who would prefer to keep the traditional dress code are, of course, free to do so. Nous allons à présent entamer la...
We will now begin the annual debate on the negative impacts of climate change on human rights pursuant to Resolution 56/8 of the Human Rights Council. The theme of the panel this year is facilitating just transitions in the context of addressing the adverse impacts of climate change on human rights. This is a meeting which is accessible to persons with disability thanks to sign language interpretation and to real-time captioning. It is an honor for me to welcome Volker Turk, High Commissioner of Human Rights, who will deliver the opening statement, and allow me also to welcome our distinguished panelists, His Excellency Mr. Tobar da Silva Nunes, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Brazil to the United Nations Office in Geneva and other international organizations, Ms. Andrea Carmen, Executive Director of the International Council of Indian Treaties, Mr. Mustafa Kamal Gueye, Director of the Priority Action Programme on Just Transition to Ecologically Sustainable Economies and Societies from the International Labour Organization, and Elisa Morgera, Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the speakers list will close in 15 minutes. I would encourage all speakers to interactively participate in this discussion, to make their comments and ask questions which reflect the statements made by panelists and in the discussion. Speaking time is 1 minute 30 seconds for all, and we will be able to listen to a maximum of 40 speakers. The delegates that are on the speakers list that have not had the opportunity to take the floor due to a lack of time will be able to upload their statements onto the extranet. And it's an honor for me now to give the floor to the High Commissioner for Human Rights for his opening statement.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President.
And distinguished delegates. The climate crisis is a human rights crisis. Rising temperatures, rising seas, floods, droughts, and wildfires threaten our rights to life, to health, to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and much more. And the heat wave that we are currently experiencing indeed leads us to the adaptability measures that are absolutely necessary, because otherwise, again, rights would be impacted as a result. It is equally clear that our current production and consumption patterns are unsustainable, and that renewables are the energy source of the future. Production capacity for renewables increased fivefold between 2011 and 2023. What we need now is a roadmap that shows us how to rethink our societies, our economies, and our politics in ways that are equitable and sustainable. That is a just transition. And this shift requires an end to the production and use of fossil fuels and other environmentally destructive activities across all sectors, from energy to farming, to finance, to construction and beyond. And this will be one of the greatest transformations our world has ever seen. And it has serious implications for human rights. If we don't safeguard people's lives, their health, their jobs, and their future opportunities, the transition will replicate and exacerbate the injustices and inequalities in our world. The rich and powerful will benefit, the poor and vulnerable will lose out. Are we taking the steps needed to protect people from climate chaos, safeguard their futures, and manage natural resources in ways that respect human rights and the environment? Sadly, the evidence so far is that we are not, particularly in the energy sector. Distinguished delegates, at this early stage of a full transition to renewables, states and companies need to take measures to ensure that no one is left behind. Take jobs, for example. The climate crisis and the transition to renewables are reshaping job markets. While the transition is projected to generate tens of millions of jobs, other jobs face potential disruption. For example, around 6 million jobs in the fossil fuel sector could be lost, and many workers are completely unprotected. And if you put this in the wider context of social protection, today, some 3.8 billion people, 3.8 billion people around the world lack any form of social safety net. And the more vulnerable a country is to climate impacts, the less likely its people are to benefit from social protection. The world can and must do better, starting with universal social protection that supports people through the transition to jobs in green industries. And let me recall that these schemes are not costly, and I'm sure it will also be part of the discussion at the World Social Summit later this year. And human rights norms and standards offer essential foundations, but also a compass for a just transition. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights affirms every person's rights to freely chosen work and to social security. Indigenous peoples have a special place in just transitions because more than half the energy transition minerals and metals projects are located on or near their lands and territories. And indigenous peoples have the right to free, prior and informed consent. And governments committed last year in the landmark declaration on future generations to creating and maintaining a clean, healthy and sustainable environment where humanity lives in harmony with nature. Human rights law is also a strong lever for progress. Recent decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and other regional and national justice institutions have clarified the human rights obligations of states to combat climate change and protect the environment. Mr. President, a just transition spans many areas: financing, gender equality, peace and security, corporate responsibility and accountability, and so much more. Respect for human rights must be a cross-cutting theme that unites all these areas. And let me give you some examples. First, development finance. Most international support for a just transition comes in the form of loans that can increase debt burdens for developing countries. Some 3.3 billion people now live in countries that spend more on debt interest payments than on either education or health, with a clear impact on the enjoyment of human rights by their people. In emerging and developing countries, debt interest payments outweigh climate investments. Human rights require scaled-up, grant-based finance that does not add to an overwhelming debt burden. Second, the gender gap in green and technological skills is growing. Women are less than 1/3 of the workforce in renewable energy sectors. Targeted measures towards gender equality are a precondition for a successful and just transition. Third, geopolitical competition among countries and companies is undermining rights and equity in the extraction of critical transition minerals. In some cases, including in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, competition over these minerals has fueled conflict. Resource governance based on human rights, led by communities, can ensure that critical minerals serve renewable energy rather than warfare. Fourth, corporate accountability for fossil fuel companies is utterly inadequate. Fossil fuel corporations perpetuate misinformation and disinformation and peddle false solutions and greenwashing that distract from continued damage. And polluters must pay. We must build on proposals, including the Billionaire Tax Initiative, and the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation to make sure people and corporations that have caused and benefit from planetary harm pay for it. At the national level, I urge states to support a just transition by building human rights economies that prioritize sustainable, inclusive development. All states need to conduct impact assessments of their budgetary, investment, and energy policies on the enjoyment of human rights and the environment. Fossil fuel subsidies need to be redirected towards renewable energy, sustainable food systems, and social safety nets. And policies need to be based on metrics that go beyond gross domestic product by measuring human development, equality, and environmental sustainability, which, again, was part of the equation of the Pact for the Future. And regulations must protect people and nature from unprincipled corporate behavior. They need to aim to reduce and eliminate discrimination and inequalities and build systems and services that are inclusive and sustainable. My office is working around the world to support governments in developing rights-based policies and laws, advocating for rights-based approaches to a just transition, and working to protect human rights defenders who are fighting for our environment. Mr. President, finally, a just transition, which is fundamental to humanity's present and future well-being, requires solidarity, cooperation, and financial support for many developing economies. I hope all governments represented here today will join forces to meet these urgent needs. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to give the floor to the panelists for their introductory statements. And I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Tovar da Silva Nunes. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, fellow panelists, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Brazil has reiterated its firm and traditional commitment to the promotion and protection of all human rights, including the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable development, and to advancing the environmental agenda, which is essential for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, it's worth recalling that within the framework of the 2030 Agenda, Goal 17 underscores the obligation of international cooperation, particularly with regard to the commitments of developed countries to provide financial resources, technology transfer, and capacity building support to developing countries. Poverty diminishes the resilience of poor populations to extreme climatic events and further hinders their effective participation in decisions related to adaptation measures. In Brazil, where poverty is marked by a clear racial bias, the debate on environmental racism and climate justice gains momentum. Brazil recognizes and values the vital role of environmental defenders, acknowledging them as human rights defenders. Their work is essential for the protection of natural resources and the preservation of the way of life of traditional and indigenous peoples, representing an important contribution to sustainable development. In Brazil, the main initiative dedicated to protecting these individuals is the National Program for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders, Communicators, and Environmentalists. Recently, a working group composed of government and civil society representatives concluded its work with the objective of rethinking existing protection strategies, strengthening the overall protection framework, and propose a national policy for the protection of human rights defenders to our Congress. It is worth highlighting that indigenous people make up the majority of individuals under protection, given their prominent role as environmental defenders. To strengthen the normative framework for the protection of human rights defenders, the Brazilian government is currently examining the ratification of the so-called Escazú Agreement, which is a regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the case of indigenous peoples, Brazil recognized their fundamental role in environmental conservation and the maintenance of social biodiversity, especially in all of the biomes, but Amazon, specifically Amazon's Cerrado and the Atlantic forest. The Brazilian government aims to guarantee and promote the protection, recovery, conservation, and sustainable use of natural resources in indigenous lands and territories. This includes the transfer of technologies and knowledge, as well as financing in the context of a just transition. These plans and the policy itself seek to strengthen indigenous autonomy and ensure that protection and sustainable development actions in their territories are aligned with their cultures and ways of life. Brazil considers of great importance enabling just transitions from a carbon-intensive economic model to a low-carbon model that leaves no one behind. We understand that just transition processes are directly related to promoting sustainable development and eradicating poverty, as well as to strengthening climate adaptation and resilience. We advocate that just transitions must respect and take into account international human rights obligations, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the right to health, and the rights of vulnerable groups such as women, youth, children, people of African descent, indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, people with disabilities, peasants, LGBTQIA+ persons, and other vulnerable groups. We believe that just transitions are largely dependent on an adequate level of financing, technology transfer, and capacity building to be provided by developed countries to developing countries, in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. A just transition of the workforce must create decent work and quality jobs, include both the formal and informal sectors. It must also address the situation of the unemployed, unpaid workers, and vulnerable groups, and must aim at reducing gender inequalities in the labor market. It shall be based on social dialogue, social protection, and the broad recognition of labor rights. We reaffirm the importance of a just energy transition, which takes into account the principles adopted by the G20 in 2024, in particular the fight against poverty, energy planning in accordance with national development priorities, and the balanced distribution of energy costs in order to reduce impacts on the poorest and most vulnerable segments of society. By hosting COP30 in Belém next November, Brazil aims to foster inclusive dialogue with indigenous peoples, traditional communities, people of African descent, youth, and the civil society, ensuring that climate solutions are equitable, participatory, and grounded in environmental justice and human rights. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Andrea Carmen, I wish to inform you that the visual material that will be presented by these panelists has been approved by the Bureau. Madam Carmen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. In June 2023, at the 59th session of the UNFCCC subsidiary bodies in Bonn, states organized their first interactive dialogue on just transition. Susanna Israelson, Sami Council, and I attended for the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, the global caucus representing the Indigenous Peoples major group. We delivered this statement. We welcome this discussion and the transition from fossil fuel-based economies that can't happen too soon for the sake of life on this planet and our future generations. Our concern is that mechanisms and criteria must be put in place to ensure that this transition is truly just. We have heard the mention of social and environmental safeguards here, but we would like to ensure that human rights safeguards are also firmly in place as a criteria for all new projects in this regard. In this process, which is so vital, we call for respect for Indigenous peoples' rights, including to free, prior, and informed consent, for our traditional lifeways and land management systems, which are almost always low carbon, as well as for our Indigenous knowledge systems that, with respectful engagement, can contribute so significantly to national and international just transition plans. We want to contribute and we want to survive. This statement remains just as relevant today as it was 2 years ago. We are actively engaged in global discussions under the UAE Just Transition Work Program and are calling for adoption of a globally agreed human rights framework that includes protection for the distinct collective rights of indigenous peoples. However, some states continue to call for removal of all references to human rights, as well as transition away from fossil fuel-based energy sources, the primary driver of climate change. They are advocating for language that leaves the essential elements of just transition in the hands of each state to determine based on their national priorities. This is a formula for continued violations of our rights by activities that drive climate change, as well as the market-based projects, including mining of so-called transition minerals carried out in the name of climate change mitigation and green energy. We are deeply disappointed that references to human rights were removed from the text on just transition at COP29 in Baku. We thank the states, including Colombia, Panama, and Mexico, who along with indigenous peoples from all regions advocated strongly at the just concluded UNFCCC SB 62 in Bonn for reinstating that language in the text that will go to COP30. We must ensure that a human rights framework, including the rights of indigenous peoples, will be the basis for how just transition is defined, evaluated, and implemented globally. We ask for your advocacy in this regard at COP30. I am from the indigenous nation of the Yaqui peoples, whose traditional Sonora Desert homelands are divided by the international border between Mexico and the United States. In December 2023 at COP28 in Dubai, Mexico and the U.S. held a joint press conference to announce Plan Sonora, which includes massive amounts of lithium mining and processing using scarce desert groundwater, the basis for subsistence and survival of indigenous peoples of the Sonora Desert. This slide shows what they call the exploratory Bacanora lithium mine currently operating in Sonora, Mexico, and the massive destruction it has already caused. Concessions for additional lithium mining are being issued in Sonora and elsewhere in Mexico. Despite our long-standing treaty relationship and the 2022 Yaqui Justice Plan, in which Mexico recommitted to respect Yaqui water rights, our traditional authorities have not been informed by Mexico about Plan Sonora, nor have good faith consultations taken place for the purpose of obtaining their free, prior, and informed consent. A lithium mine operating in Nevada, USA, opposed by the impacted indigenous peoples, has used 4 billion gallons of groundwater a year since 2022. Open pit lithium mining produces 37 tons of CO2 per ton of lithium and contaminates groundwater up to 150 miles away. Mapuche leaders from the so-called lithium triangle in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia report a similar lack of FPIC, as well as contamination and depletion of their traditionally used water sources. Is this really just transition? I highlight, as I conclude my remarks, some positive ways that indigenous peoples are contributing to a key aspect of just transition away from industrial food production based on large-scale agriculture and livestock enterprises, which produce an estimated 25% of the world's greenhouse gases and cause deforestation, soil degradation by agrochemicals, biodiversity loss, and unsustainable water use. This slide shows methods and strategies indigenous peoples are implementing today for low-carbon food production using traditional seeds, animals, and water restoration methods. This includes growing crops without pesticides to protect the health of living soil, the third largest absorber of greenhouse gases after the oceans and the atmosphere. It also shows drought-resistant seed trading between indigenous farmers, restoration of traditional water systems and original food sources, such as buffalo, that withstand a range of climate conditions and restore rather than deplete native grasslands. In closing, I recognize and congratulate the work of the Special Rapporteur, Elisa Morgera, the UN Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition minerals, and various other UN human rights mandate holders and bodies who have also affirmed that human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples must be at the core of just transition policies, programs, and activities globally. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mustafa Kamal Gueye has the floor now. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, decent work is a human right. It is the right to opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace and social protection for all, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize and participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and the right to equality and opportunity and treatment for all women and men. Because of climate change, this very human right of the decent work is fundamentally challenged today. Let us start with how a changing climate will impact the world of work. We estimate that more than 2.4 billion workers, this is 70% of the total workforce, is likely to be exposed to excessive heat at some point in time. And by 2030, on a global average, 2% of the total working time and labor productivity would be lost. This comes to 80 million full-time jobs. So this is why social protection is fundamental to enhance the resilience against climate shocks, those that result from the slow onset events, we know like drought and the warming of temperatures, but also the sudden onset events like hurricanes and flooding. The good news is that in 2024, for the first time, more than half of the world population got access to a form of social security. The sad reality is that in the 20 countries most vulnerable to the climate crisis, less than 9% of their population is covered by any form of social protection. This means that from a climate resilience perspective, nations are far from achieving that human right to social protection. Investments in social protection need to be scaled up, and this must move from shock responses to institutionalized and right-based approaches. Mr. President, Excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen, productive economies have the potential to deliver more and better jobs. And here we have a positive narrative. Shifting to low carbon and circular economies has the potential to generate some 100 million new jobs by 2030. And in 2023, together with the International Renewable Energy Agency, we estimated that 16 million people worked in clean energies. I want to speak about adaptation-related employment. The ILO, together with UN Environment Programme and the IUCN, have estimated that today 60 million people are currently engaged in nature-based solutions activities. And with more investments, NBS can generate up to 32 million jobs by 2030. This means that the efforts that countries and communities are putting on adaptation can be an important driver for new job creation. However, despite these prospects of important social and economic benefits, one should not underestimate the complexity and the difficulty of the transition to sustainability. Some will unavoidably lose jobs, income, and business assets, which means that policymakers and decision makers that you are in the public and private sectors must manage geographical and temporal disconnections as the economic and the job gains are not emerging in the same location and at the same time as job and income loss occurs. And this is why a just transition for all is imperative. Just transition involves maximizing the economic and social benefits of the ecological transition while minimizing and managing carefully any risk of social and economic disruption. It requires integrated policies. However, policy process is as important as policy content. A strong social consensus is indispensable to enable collective action. However, today, we face a deficit in social dialogue. Less than 20% of the nationally determined contributions to climate change include references to social dialogue. And if we turn it to firm level action, we find that only 23% of the collective bargaining agreements between workers and their employers address environmental issues. So much more has to be done on social dialogue. We need to have opportunities for reskilling and upskilling of the 78 million people that we find will be impacted in the ecological transition. So therefore, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the global climate agenda is a human story, and it is about human rights, and it is about decent work. The ambition that nations and the global community seek cannot be confined to numerical targets and indicators. The ambition must fundamentally be about people, workers with the right skills to transform our energy, transport and food systems, enterprises that innovate, develop new business models and provide society with better goods and services, and communities able to transform and diversify their economies to thrive and sustain livelihoods. All these are about political, economic, and social rights. The ILO, through its tripartite constituency and normative mandate, and through the Global Coalition for Social Justice, is engaged in promoting the right to a decent work and advancing social justice so that no one is left behind in a world battling to sustain economies, generate prosperity, and enhance human well-being for all. I thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai l'honneur de...
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Madame Elisa Modera. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished panelists, and distinguished delegates. Human rights provide critical norms, processes, and evidence for all just transition efforts, domestically and in the context of international cooperation. Human rights also clarify the responsibility of business, including multinational companies, to implement mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence throughout transnational value chains. While all human rights are relevant to the just transition, as they are independent, interdependent, and indivisible, I would like to focus our attention particularly on the synergies between the human right to a healthy environment and the right to development in the context of the just transition. The evidence of the economic inequalities associated with the activities that cause climate change must be central to just transition efforts. Wealth concentration and global and local socioeconomic impacts of climate change on different economic sectors and different sectors of society, including declining living standards and higher living costs, they all cause negative impacts on the rights to life, health, adequate standard of living, and cultural rights. On the basis of that evidence, the right to development can and must be understood as states' obligations to develop new economic models that address economic inequalities by deprioritizing the demands of the richest groups in society who worsen social exclusion and extreme poverty. As part and parcel of these efforts, the right to development calls on states to develop economic models that provides goods and services that enhance human and planetary well-being and reduce the production of unnecessary and toxic products. In other words, the right to development should be interpreted and applied in ways that fully align with all the substantive elements of the human right to a healthy environment. And this chimes with our most recent global scientific assessments on the nexus of climate change, biodiversity, food, water, and health. Furthermore, the just transition should be pursued in accordance with states' obligations to prevent discrimination, including by discontinuing patterns of racial discriminations and prioritizing reparations for historical climate harm, domestically and in international relations. Domestically, the creation of sacrifice zones, land grabbing, forced displacement, and conflicts are all elements that should be clearly prevented as part of the just transition. Internationally, global partners of structural racial discrimination that are based on an equal distribution of power among states and between states and transnational corporations result in disproportionate benefits accruing to nations, companies, and consumers in the global north. So the economic models we need to prevent discrimination, including from an intergenerational equity perspective. The human rights of future generations entail that states should not shift the burden of mitigating and remedying climate change to future generations. And the human rights of children today entail the states prioritize just transition approaches in the best interest of the child, in accordance with children's right to development, and respecting children's agency and their right to be heard and not to be bound by the choices made by others that can severely detriment their rights in the present and in the future. Crucially, the right to development must be interpreted so as to support the right to self-determination, considering that the survival of states that contribute minimally to climate change is impaired by loss of territory to sea level rise and by protracted unsafe climate conditions. But also people are substantially deprived of their means of subsistence because of severe deterioration of entire ecosystems due to climate change. And the cultural survival of populations of small island developing states, indigenous peoples, people of African descent, peasants, and small-scale fishers is impaired by loss of territories, protracted unsafe climatic conditions, and severe ecosystem degradation. Sustainable economic models for the just transition must therefore be construed on the basis of the insights and lived experience of the human rights holders that have been most affected by climate change and by those who are already or will be most likely negatively affected by just transition efforts, notably workers that will be affected by the fossil fuel phase out. Meaningful participation and inclusion in the just transition supports transformative change. Indigenous peoples, peasants, women, persons with disabilities, marginalized groups should not be seen as a matter of social acceptability of climate solutions, but rather as co-developers of the broader economic models that can serve planetary and human well-being. So we need to understand the just transition as transformation across sectors. And in my report this year to the Human Rights Council on defossilization, I focus on the need to phase out fossil fuels, not only in the energy sector, but also in terms of plastic production and production of petrochemical products that we find in our food systems and in our health systems and across our innovation efforts. So this is where we realize that addressing the root causes of climate change and the planetary crisis we're facing serves to realize a multitude of international objectives: climate change mitigation, prevention of toxic pollution, protection of nature, the most impactful health intervention, and finding sources of much needed climate finance. So crucially, we can't just look at fixes and replacing, for instance, one source of energy with another, because we are risking, and we're already seeing evidence of how those narrow approaches to the transition are not only ineffective, but reiterate the same causes of climate change and planetary crisis. And to that end, we need to critically assess our energy needs and our energy need projections, including critical mineral mining projections, with a view to tackling overconsumption and overproduction patterns that perpetuate climate change and climate injustice. And so all states should conduct comprehensive environmental and human rights assessments of their energy needs and energy demand projections, focusing on energy poverty and other inequities in the energy sector that have affected the cost of living and standards of living, focusing on energy overconsumption by the richest, focusing on the dependency on exported or imported fossil fuels in developing countries, notably least developed countries and small island developing states, and options for defossilizing different economic sectors in the light of environmental and health benefits, particularly for children. In terms of a global perspective and international cooperation, it's also essential that we focus on the need for reforms of international investment law, which is currently hindering just transition legislation and policies. Multinational fossil fuel companies are currently benefiting from undue protection against climate action under bilateral investment agreements, contracts, and investor-state dispute settlement. They are awarded compensation, in fact, exorbitant compensation, when states take climate measures they may impact their expected profits, including in circumstances where damages would not be available under national law. And historically, roughly the equivalent of the gross domestic product of 45 of the world's poorest or smallest countries put together has been awarded in damages to fossil fuel companies. What this means is that states and taxpayers are paying fossil fuel companies compensation for blocking our attempts to advance the transition. And this also means that we're diverting public funding from investments in renewables, adaptation, and workers' social protection. I thank you for your attention.
Merci.
Thank you. We will now start the speakers list, which is now closed. I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. The EU welcomes today's panel discussion advancing this Council's work on human rights impacts of climate change. We fully support the call for a just transition as a key pathway to address climate change while ensuring the full realization of human rights for all. Climate change and environmental degradation continue to have a massive adverse impact on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights across the globe. A just transition must be inclusive and rights-based, ensuring that no one is left behind. At the EU level, this is the central principle for the European Green Deal through instruments such as Just Transition Mechanism, mobilizing up to 55 billion euros between years 2021 and 27. It includes a Just Transition Fund addressing social and economic impacts of the transition, supporting the most affected. Just transition pathways towards a net zero and climate resilient society should contribute to respecting, promoting and fulfilling human rights. We encourage the inclusion of these considerations in climate action. We support partner countries in reducing emissions and adapting to climate impacts through our external engagement, whether via mobilization of climate finance, international cooperation, or multilateral engagement. Just transition is not merely a policy choice, it is a moral imperative. We look forward to working with global partners to seize its opportunities and meet its challenges. Thank you.
I thank you and give the floor to Iceland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, climate change has widespread impacts on the realization of human rights, affecting fundamental aspects of life such as the right to food, water, health and housing, with severe implications for those in vulnerable situations. In vulnerable situations such as migrants affected by climate change, existing gender inequalities can be exacerbated, impacting women and girls disproportionately, including through increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence. Addressing the adverse impacts of climate change requires a multifaceted approach, encompassing mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage, amongst others. A human rights-based approach to climate action emphasizes public participation, accountability, and the needs of those most affected by climate change. Just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all should be fair, equitable, and inclusive. Meaningful, inclusive, and safe participation is foundational to comprehensive and effective just transition policies, planning, and implementation. Distinguished panel, we know that our societies have to be transformed. Transformation presents both opportunities and challenges for the workforce. How can a just transition be advanced And what steps must countries take to ensure broad-based support for this transformation? I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ghana on behalf of a group of African states.
Thank you, Mr. President. The African Group welcomes this panel and aligns itself with its objectives of deepening the understanding of the adverse impact of climate change on human rights. We recognize that just transitions are essential to achieving climate justice in a way that respects, protects, and promotes human rights. Africa remains one of the regions most severely affected by climate change, despite being one of the lowest contributors to global emissions. In this context, we advocate that transitions should be inclusive, equitable, and centered on human dignity, creating an environment that favors the participation of all communities in decision-making. Finally, we would like to emphasize that the success of just transitions depends not only on reducing emissions, but also on promoting justice, equity, and development for all, especially in developing countries. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Democratic Republic of the Congo on behalf of the Groupe des États membres de la Francophonie.
Monsieur le Président.
President, this statement is made on behalf of the Francophone ambassadors. Climate change is a major challenge. The harmful impacts of it can be seen every day. They deepen inequalities, notably with respect to women, but also people in vulnerable situations, the elderly, people living with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and in particular children, but above all, girls. As we face this urgent situation, we affirm our historic commitment to fight climate change, ensuring that there is a just, inclusive transition, and the SDGs are put in place to guarantee basic rights. We reaffirm our strong, active commitment, including supporting the participation of women, facilitating innovation, and introducing new innovative solutions. For example, the OIF is supporting environmental initiatives to preserve the Congo Basin. This organization calls for efforts to be redoubled to guarantee the rights of future generations. Together, we can transform challenges into opportunities for peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the representative of Bahrain on behalf of a group of Arab states. Thank you, President. I have the honor of making this statement on behalf of the group of Arab states. We would like to thank High Commissioner for Human Rights, the various speakers who spoke before us. We welcome this important meeting. A just transition is vital to fight climate change whilst also respecting human rights and the dignity of women, young people, and people with disabilities. We want to highlight the following. Climate change already challenges the right to life, health, drinking water and food in the most vulnerable countries and coastal countries. We must adopt a holistic approach based on mitigation and adaptation, also including participation by all parts of society, whilst ensuring social protections for the most vulnerable to build more resilient societies. We call for funds to be brought together for loss and damage and international partnerships involving LDCs and SIDS. We, in conclusion, would like to express our will to support all efforts in this area. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant.
Thank you. I now recognize Bangladesh on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Core Group on Human Rights and Climate Change Resolution. Mr. President, as a result of adverse impacts of climate change, 132 million additional people might be pushed into poverty by 2030, an estimation of the World Bank. If the world fails to take immediate climate action, hunger will spiral out of control, as cautioned by the WFP. Moreover, climate-induced disasters will increase the likelihood of conflicts in the most fragile regions, and 260 million people would be internally displaced worldwide by 2050, which is not too far. It is high time to galvanize international cooperation and assistance for undertaking urgent global climate action. Developing countries, including LDCs and SEEDs, are the hardest hit by climate change, despite being the least contributors to the incremental global warming. We reiterate the urgency of scaling up action and support, in particular in financing, technology transfer, and capacity building for facilitating just transitions through mitigation and adaptation measures. Also to assist developing countries in averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. We look forward to hearing from the esteemed panelists regarding fair, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable just transition pathways, which will create decent work opportunities, reduce inequalities, and enhance human rights for all. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la... Thank you. I now recognize the distinguished representative of Malaysia on behalf of ASEAN.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the member states of ASEAN and Timor-Leste. ASEAN recognizes that climate change has profound impacts on the enjoyment of human rights, disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups, including women, children, older people, people with disabilities, people living in these rural and remote areas. We underscore the importance of facilitating a just transition to a low-carbon regional economy, ensuring that the transition pathways are fair, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable, leaving no one behind, with special attention given to supporting those most affected by climate change. ASEAN has adopted regional tools to support these efforts, including the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance, and cross-border renewable energy cooperation. These initiatives aim to ensure that transitions are fair, equitable. ASEAN is finalizing the ASEAN Climate Change Strategic Action Plan 2025-2030, which will serve as a roadmap for member states to collectively address climate change. The ongoing establishment of the ASEAN Center for Climate Change will further advance our inclusive and coordinated efforts in addressing climate change. ASEAN emphasizes the need for enhanced international cooperation and support to develop zero and low emission technologies and solutions, and accelerate technology transfer, innovation, and the development of human and institutional capacities. This is essential to ensure that no one is left behind in the transition process. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la... Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia on behalf of a group of countries.
Shukran, Sayyid Rais.
Thank you, Mr. President. Saudi Arabia has the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of 62 states. The full version of the statement will be uploaded to the extranet. The short form, climate finance is severely undermining the ability of developing countries to safeguard human rights and build climate resilience. We remain gravely concerned that the adverse impacts of climate change continue to threaten the full and effective enjoyment of human rights worldwide, particularly in developing countries. Mr. President, we emphasize the importance of the commitment to the full, effective, and sustained implementation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Paris Agreement. This commitment is integral to advancing sustainable development, eradicating poverty, ending hunger and malnutrition, and strengthening the resilience of livelihoods, contributing to the achievement of the Convention's ultimate objective. We stress that under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities remains a cornerstone of international climate cooperation. Developed countries have a clear obligation to take the lead in reducing emissions and providing support in finance, technology, and capacity building. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by increasing efforts by some states to dilute or disregard the principles of CBDR, a move that undermines decades of multilateral consensus and shifts of burdens. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Marshall Islands on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am pleased to deliver this joint statement on behalf of a group of Pacific Island states as listed on the extranet. Climate change is the greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the people in the Pacific. Those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis and are the most vulnerable to its impacts. The international community must respond to the human rights threats posed by climate change and sea level rise, reaffirming the preservation of maritime boundaries and continuity of statehood. Global climate action must be rapid, sustained, and transformative, and it must be gender responsive and empower youth and children. We call on states to deliver nationally determined contributions with ambitious economy-wide emission reduction targets covering all sectors, greenhouse gases and categories, and aligned with the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limit. NDC should respond to the first global stocktake outcomes, including the transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. We call for sustained quality and accessible climate finance, particularly for adaptation and loss and damage, and to address debt challenges. All efforts should take into account the human rights of those vulnerable to climate change. Komodada, and I thank you.
Merci. Je donne
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Barbados on behalf of CARICOM.
Thank you very much, Chair. On behalf of CARICOM member states in Geneva, we thank all the panelists for firmly placing a human rights perspective at the center of climate change. The facts are undeniable. Small island states are at the front lines of this existential crisis, and it is the most vulnerable in our and in any society that will suffer the most from climate disasters. Women and girls, the disabled community, the elderly, indigenous persons, migrant communities, and those who are economically and socially marginalized are most at risk. There's a need to better understand and respond to their priorities before, during, and after a crisis. Facilitating just transitions is not just about recovery, it is about building resilience. And this entails access to climate financing, especially grant financing, dialogue with social partners, access to technology, focusing on the role of insurance sectors in mobilizing disaster finance and climate investment, global investment in migration, in mitigation, adaptation, and a recommitment to the 1.5 degree promise. The Caribbean is on the front lines of the crisis, but we will also remain on the front lines of supporting a greater spotlight on just transitions and resilience building. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Council of Europe.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Pollution and climate change represent existential threat to our planet and societies. These crises demand urgent and coordinated action. The Council of Europe has long been a pioneer in environmental protection, particularly on natural heritage, landscape, and biodiversity. Today, we face a climate emergency that not only endangers our ecosystems, but also poses fundamental challenges to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. A clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is indispensable to the full enjoyment of human rights. This essential postulate has been consistently affirmed by the European Court of Human Rights and the European Committee of Social Rights. It is also at the heart of the recommendation on human rights and the protection of the environment, which provides a comprehensive framework for member states to ensure that human rights are respected in the context of environmental governance. Last month, the Committee of Ministers adopted a 5-year strategy for the environment, which integrates human rights, democratic governance, and the rule of law into environmental policy and action across all sectors. It places a strong focus on just transition, ensuring that climate and environmental action is socially fair and leaves no one behind. The Council of Europe remains a committed actor. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I now recognize Jamaica.
Mr. President, the Jamaican delegation thanks the panel for their insightful contributions and refers to Jamaica's oral submission to the ICJ hearings on climate change, which highlighted the clear and present danger presented by the climate crisis for many small island developing states. The government of Jamaica has pursued targeted initiatives to align our national development priorities with climate action. However, developing countries like ours urgently need greater international support through adequate and predictable climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. We therefore call for greater recognition of the human rights implications of climate action and inaction. The participation of affected communities, including youth and women in decision-making processes, and most critically, the honoring of financial commitments made under the Paris Agreement, including through the Loss and Damage Fund. A just transition is a necessity and the responsibility of states in fulfilling their human rights obligations. Finally, Jamaica reaffirms its commitment to cooperate with partners to ensure a transition grounded in equity and human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg. Thank you, President. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. We wish to thank the panelists for their very interesting statements, which emphasize appropriately the need to have a comprehensive approach, bearing in mind environmental, social, and economic dimensions. Today, we have the opening of the 4th Conference on Financing for Development in Seville, and it's an opportunity, a crucial one, to strengthen the links between climate commitments, financing for development which is sustainable, and human rights. There's no sustainable development without sustainable financing. It is essential that financial flows support the most vulnerable, guarantee equality, and fully respect the principles of inclusion and transparency. We restate our commitment to the 2030 Agenda and the principle of not leaving anyone behind. Luxembourg would like to insist on the importance of technical assistance, which allows least developed countries to chart a safe course connecting climate protection to bringing about everyone's rights all the time. This also includes making the most of indigenous knowledge, which is essential for sustainable, local, and fair solutions. We also support, through the Forest and Climate Change Funds, employment-generating projects in areas of high poverty in Guatemala to make sure that local communities can benefit by offering them local forest value chains while combating deforestation. Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates. And this is why we have an integrated approach, which to boost investment, invest in energy and employment policies, and shoring up our capacities in order to support global efforts. We have held the first meeting of the Fund for Loss and Damages in order to ensure a just transition. We are committed to cooperating with Brazil, looking forward to COP30, and we want to consider the best possible ways to ensure climate financing, bearing in mind the needs of the most vulnerable countries facing this scourge, ensuring that they can appropriately adapt to climate change. Thank you.
Merci. Je passe ma...
Thank you. I would now like to move on to the list of speakers of national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, and I give the floor to the National Human Rights Committee of Qatar.
انطلاقا من الأثر السلبي لتغير المناخ على
Given the negative impact of climate change on human rights, and building on the efforts of the National Human Rights Commission of Qatar, well, we are closely monitoring the situation and commend the efforts made by the Special Rapporteur. We would urge you to focus on the following: the outcome of the Doha statement following the international conference organized by our Commission in February 2023 on climate change and human rights. This was in alliance with the UNDP and the League of Arab States. We would urge you to support states, ensuring that they have appropriate technical assistance, enabling them to take necessary measures. There must also be involvement of national human rights institutions that are a privileged partner, ensuring the achievement of results, protecting the most vulnerables. We must also review policies for indigenous peoples and ensuring that rights holders have access to necessary mechanisms to obtain justice. Thank you.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Les textes législatifs relatifs à la protection à l'environnement dans un code unifié, garantissant la pleine effectivité des droits de l'homme.
Environmental protection. There must be strengthened coordination between the different stakeholders working on environmental issues in
impacts of climate change continue, the full transition away from the fossil economy is imperative. The solar, wind, and electric vehicle industries in particular are critical to this transition. However, many industries currently carry significant human rights risks from a forced labor perspective. For example, migrant workers are facing severe exploitation in the growing renewable energy sector in the Gulf region, where companies and investors are reliant on an exploitative labor model to deliver their green energy projects. The solar and electric vehicle industries and broader critical mineral sourcing are heavily implicated in forced labor in the Uyghur region, where the Chinese government is systematically persecuting Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim majority peoples. A central element of this persecution occurs through state-imposed forced labor. We must ensure the transition to green energy is not reliant on human suffering. To help achieve this, government should introduce mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, accompanied by import controls on products made in whole or in part or transported with forced labor that effectively tackle state-imposed forced labor and incentivize remediation. Cooperate internationally to support investment in alternative technologies and sources of supply, and meaningfully consult relevant independent trade unions and affected communities. Thank you.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Global Institute for Water, Environment and Health for a video statement.
Mr. President, we thank the panel for emphasizing that climate action must be rooted in human rights. We're deeply concerned about the role of the United Arab Emirates, which has presented itself as a climate leader while simultaneously undermining core human rights, including the right to privacy and freedom of expression. The UAE has repeatedly spit on human rights defenders, environmental activists, and journalists, both domestically and internationally, using intrusive surveillance technologies. This creates a chilling effect that prevents genuine public participation in climate policy and silence voices calling for justice and accountability. Meaningfully, climate action cannot exist without civic space. It cannot exist in an environment of repression, censorship, and fear. We call on this Council and the panel to recognize that climate-related surveillance and repressions are human rights violation, ensure that countries engaging in such practices are not shielding from scrutiny because of their financial influence in climate diplomacy, and urge all states, including the UAE, to end digital repression and represent the rights of environment defenders. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Center for International Environmental Law.
CL welcomes this panel discussion. As climate impacts intensify worldwide, the imperative for an ambitious, science-based and rights-based system-wide transition is clearer than ever. An effective just transition must begin with a full, fast phase-out of fossil fuels across all sectors. It must be grounded in human rights, free and prior informed consent, equity, and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It must center affected communities, workers, marginalized groups, and indigenous peoples. The rights to participation, access to information, and justice should be the cornerstone of such processes. This also includes protecting environmental and human rights defenders who risk their lives to advance climate justice. A truly just transition must avoid replicating the harms of the extractive fossil fuel economy, particularly the social and environmental impacts associated with the mining of transition minerals. It must also guarantee access to effective remedy for communities and workers harmed by both the fossil fuel economy and the transition process. States must also reject speculative and unproven technologies, such as carbon capture, geoengineering, and offsets, that delay real action and entrench inequalities. Real science-based climate solutions secure energy sovereignty, foster democratic systems of production and consumption, and empower communities. Only by addressing systemic injustice and upholding the rights of people and the planet can the transition be truly just. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la...
Thank you. I give the floor to the Chinese Association for International Understanding for a video statement.
Dear President, I'm Tang Yingxia from Human Rights Research Center at Nankai University and speak on behalf of Chinese Association for International Understanding. I'm deeply impressed by the Special Rapporteurs report. It clarifies states' international human rights obligations and business responsibilities to phase out fossil fuels. And I agree with the Special Rapporteur that defossilization is necessary to truly open up a just, human-based transition to renewable energy. It is certain that the realization of all this depends on transparency. Then I will present China's practices in of corporate information disclosure. First, from the top-level design perspective, fundamental guidelines of corporate sustainability disclosure standards has put forward requirements for corporate sustainable information disclosure and prevented greenwashing risks. Second, regulation on carbon emission trading requires key greenhouse gas emitters to disclose carbon emission information. Third, listed companies are required to publish their ESG reports by the end of 2026. At the same time, diverse and different practices of ESG information disclosure has been carried out in various regions. As of the end of September 2024, the ESG report disclosure rate for listed central state-owned companies reached 99.6%. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. We have now concluded the first segment of the speakers list and move straight on to the second. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, 10 years ago, the Paris Agreement recognized the concepts of climate justice and the fact that everyone must bear in mind their respective human rights obligations, the right to health, the rights of indigenous peoples and that of other people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equality and fairness. Since then, we have moved to the promotion of just transition measures to sustainable economies that are resilient and low in emissions in order to protect the human rights of all. Despite having a marginal responsibility when it comes to global emissions, For all of these reasons, Ecuador has adopted climate policies that have a comprehensive approach and that allow us to move towards an ecological transition. We want to create employment, reduce inequality, strengthen the full respect and protection of human rights, especially for the most vulnerable, and look at the multidimensional effects of climate change. We hope that this is a panel that will lead to an exchange of good practices, stimulating opportunities, and particularly increasing cooperation and national investment and sustainable foreign investment in the respect of human rights for all. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Thank you, President. Tunisia wishes to restate its commitment to the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change and to the Paris Agreement. When it comes to respecting our commitments and the efforts that we're making to face climate change and to adapt, Tunisia has adopted the national transition strategy, which has 50 goals. It has included climate change in its priorities as part of its development strategy 2023 to 25. We have seen a greater impact of climate change on societies, and this has had a knock-on effect on measures that countries have taken. There have certainly been human rights consequences. Our country has had very severe effects, despite the fact that we are not responsible for it coming about. The situation requires a global response on the basis of common but shared but differentiated responsibilities. We need to be in a position to better face climate change, and we have to ensure there is sustainable financing for adaptation and mitigation. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Climate change is a defining threat to the full realization of human rights, especially in developing countries. India believes that the concept of just transition must be far broader than currently perceived. For transition pathways to be truly just and rights-based, equity, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and global climate justice must be at the core of all discussions. Just transition cannot be reduced to a platform for prescriptive, top-down approaches that disregard nationally determined priorities. Too often, discussions at the Council sidestep these core principles, ignoring the overriding priority of development for global South countries, which face pervasive and persistent challenges of inequalities in energy, infrastructure, and financing. Just transitions must foreground the vastly different national circumstances and starting points. We must discuss the key enablers and disablers of just transitions, including unilateral trade measures, restrictive intellectual property regimes, and the inequitable distribution of transition cost. Taking into account adequate and just means of implementation is also essential. Transitions in developing countries must not be treated as merely investment opportunities with a high human cost. Preserving carbon space is vital for poverty eradication and inclusive growth. Mr. President, India remains committed to climate action that is human-centric, development-oriented, and adheres to the principle of global climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. تؤكد حكومة جمهورية
Thank you, President. Iraq reiterates its firm commitment to the protection of the environment and combating climate change. This is a national priority. We feel the need to protect biodiversity and the environment, and in order to do this, we've adopted many measures since 2009 and a new strategy for the period 2024 to 28. This includes measures to ensure safeguarding the environment, moving to clean energy, and protecting green spaces. This is pursuant to the nationally determined contributions. We have few water resources as one of our challenges. We also see rising temperatures and desertification, and yet we have redoubled efforts to launch our national strategy for environmental protection 2024-2030, which was adopted in September 2024 in a bid to overcome our challenges, especially the loss of biodiversity and desertification. We have seen greater participation of women in this area, and we insist on the chair interrupts the speaker. Thank you very much. Climate change is a direct threat to the right to a decent life. It's speeding up, and we see this in more natural disasters which affect basic rights, such as the right to food, housing, and safety, especially in the most vulnerable countries. This causes displacements, hunger, illness, and deprivations, which do away with the social and economic achievements that we've come about with such difficulty. The Dominican Republic believes that we have to move to a sustainable economy, and it's not an option, it's essential. We have put in place a law on climate change, which is rights-based, and we have a national strategy for sustainable development. And we have nationally determined contributions, which focuses on adaptation and resilience. But no country can do this alone. We need solidarity globally, promoting financing, access to clean technology, and effective cooperation for the transfer of knowledge and technology. We believe that it's right for the Human Rights Council to continue to focus on climate change on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities. We have to protect lives and guarantee rights, leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à...
Thank you. I give the floor to the FAO.
Mr. President, FAO welcomes the Council's focus on facilitating just transitions as we confront the adverse impacts of climate change on human rights. This emphasis on equity and inclusion will enable more ambitious and effective climate action and climate resilient development. Climate action and human rights, especially the right to food, must advance together. Climate change is a threat multiplier for hunger and inequality, and those least responsible suffer the most. A just transition means empowering vulnerable farmers and rural communities, including women and youth, with the tools, technologies, and support to adapt and thrive in a green economy. It also means aligning climate policies with social protection and equity, ensuring no one is left behind. FAO's approach is to integrate climate resilience with poverty reduction and sustainable development, a holistic approach to maximize co-benefits and address trade-offs. We stand ready to support member states in turning these principles into concrete and rights-based action. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, my delegation thanks the High Commissioner for his opening statements and the panelists. We welcome the commitment to just transition that safeguards human rights and promotes a healthy environment for all. A just transition is crucial for Sierra Leone, given our extreme climate vulnerability, climate impacts, such as rising sea levels, mudslides, and drought, severely affect rural farmers, coastal communities, and informal workers who are already marginalized and lack adequate social protections. Sierra Leone's climate strategy prioritizes fairness, inclusion, and human rights. These principles are integrated into our National Climate Change Policy and Adaptation Plan, which focuses on providing access to clean energy and launch solar initiatives, among other things. Community climate councils in 100 chief zones promote inclusive participation and ensure equitable distribution of benefits. However, significant challenges remain. Sierra Leone's extractive mineral projects have strained ecosystems and marginalized communities. We call on development partners to appropriately target finance for small-scale green enterprises and support the extension of social safety nets so vulnerable community workers are shielded from the shocks of change. A just transition requires an integrated, systemic approach to energy, ecosystems, infrastructure, industry, and society. To achieve a healthy society environment, we call for a sustained investment, robust legal protection, and transparent value-sharing models. And I thank you, President.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cameroon. Thank you very much, President. Cameroon welcomes this annual discussion on the negative effects of climate change on the effective exercise of human rights. We thank the Office of the High Commissioner for their commitment on this question, which relates to the future of all of humanity. Climate change is really happening, and the consequences we can see, particularly in developing countries. Cameroon is the green lung of Central Africa because of its wealth of forest ecosystems. This is why we're firmly attached to the comprehensive implementation of the Paris Agreement and other relevant multilateral instruments. We have to abide by the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. In 2025, my country has for the first time brought in climate-sensitive budgeting. We want to step up our fight on waste and put in place a national roadmap for a circular economy, moving towards green and resilient growth. Our ambition is clear. We want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 35%. We believe that sustainable development, which respects human rights, is both possible and necessary. We would encourage the High Commissioner to continue his efforts to ensure that the link between human rights and climate change is a pillar of his mandate. That's how we will meet the challenge for our planet. Thank you. I don't see Niger in the floor, so I give the floor to Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the panelists for their insightful observations and welcome this rich and timely discussion. We also align with the CARICOM Group statement. As a small island developing state, Trinidad and Tobago continues to navigate the complex interplay between national development imperatives, economic diversification, and the protection of human rights, particularly in the face of increased vulnerability to climate change. In pursuing efforts to transition from an oil and gas-based economy to an environmentally sustainable, climate-resilient one, the government is prioritizing social dialogue, decent work, and social protection, all key pillars of a just transition. Technical cooperation has also been essential. Initiatives such as the 2023 Just Transition Workshop held in Trinidad and Tobago in partnership with the British High Commission, the ILO, and our Energy Chamber highlight the value of collaboration in pursuing a just transition, one that takes into account environmental considerations, structural changes to labor markets, and emerging technologies. The ILO's Global Coalition for Social Justice, of which we are a member, also provides a useful framework for meaningful cooperation and partnerships. We reiterate in this regard the continued importance of financing, technical assistance, and cooperation with key regional and international partners to SIDS such as Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, Nepal thanks the distinguished panel for the insights on the adverse impacts of climate change and the importance of just transitions. Climate change continues to undermine the human rights of millions around the world, particularly in vulnerable and mountain economies. Nepal is disproportionately bearing the brunt of climate change despite its negligible carbon emissions. To augment its ongoing call for climate action, the government of Nepal hosted the first ever Sagarmatha Sambad, meaning Mount Everest Dialogue, a multi-stakeholder dialogue forum last May in Kathmandu under the theme Climate Change, Mountains, and the Future of Humanity. We need a shared resolve and collective commitment to climate action and just transitions through multi-stakeholder partnerships, enhanced access to climate finance, and appropriate technologies. In this regard, we would like to hear from the distinguished panel about the measures best suited for developing and climate vulnerable countries in the efforts towards human rights-based climate action and just transitions. Thank you.
Merci. Je ne vois pas la...
Thank you. I now give I see No Libya in the room, so I give the floor to Cambodia.
Pas ici non plus.
Also absent. So I give the floor to Colombia.
Colombia.
Señor Presidente.
President, Colombia hopes to be carbon zero by 2050, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 by 51%, and to scale down its use of fossil fuel, which are mainly driving climate change. The just transition isn't just about an energy source change. It's about making human changes, which requires fairness, balance across the territory, and social justice. It's an opportunity to overcome historic social inequalities. We have to move to a decarbonized economy. And this must also be done at the local level, and it must involve the participation of groups that are in a vulnerable situation, indigenous peoples, women, local communities, migrants, displaced persons, children, young people, and persons with disability, amongst others. Nobody must be left behind. Our national development plans sees this as a way forward towards a productive economy with social justice based on sustainable infrastructure and technology, amongst other things. We have to have an intersectoral strategy. These are not separate goals. Many things are two faces of the same coin. This is why our environmental decisions must be an opportunity to build fairer and more resilient societies. Thank you. I give the floor to this distinguished representative of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
The Sovereign Order of Malta continues to be deeply concerned about the adverse impacts of climate change and its effect on human rights. The many extremes in climate-related impact we have witnessed and how these have disproportionately affected certain communities highlight the need for promoting practical responses to that are fair, balanced, and responsive to local needs. In our work with Maltese International, our international relief agency, we have taken into account the climate-related challenges affecting communities while continuing to respond to their most urgent needs. In northern Uganda, in cooperation with Impact Building Solutions Foundation, Maltese International is working to promote carbon-neutral construction while creating new jobs and perspectives for refugees and members of the local host communities. In Colombia, we support around 4,000 people displaced by conflict, many of whom have lost their livelihoods. Climate change further strains natural resources, threatening income and food security. Our response includes training in sustainable farming, disaster preparedness, and eco-friendly livelihoods like beekeeping, recognizing the vital link between communities and their environment. Ensuring such access across all regions helps enable practical, local-driven responses to climate change. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Nobody here? Je donne la parole au
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Mr. President, the climate crisis is raging with devastating consequences to the enjoyment of human rights by all. The window for meaningful climate action is fast closing. A just transition towards sustainability in the global economy has never been more urgent. We welcome the agreement reached at the IMO in April 2025 on the 2025 net zero framework, which sets fuel standards and greenhouse gas emissions pricing for the shipping industry's decarbonization to net zero by 2050. International shipping transports around 90% of world trade that are essential to the smooth functioning of our societies. But this comes at a cost to the environment and the climate system. Shipping accounts for 3% of global GHG emissions. This milestone deal is therefore a necessary recalibration towards the path of sustainability and resilience. As this green transition unfolds, we must keep the very people that work in this strategic industry at the center of policy discussions and interventions. These include the seafarers who operate the ships that ply our oceans to deliver life-sustaining goods in good and bad times. New technologies and the shift to alternative fuels will inevitably redefine the seafaring profession, particularly in terms of new competencies needed in the health and safety of seafarers. Esteemed panelists, how do we ensure that the human rights, safety, and well-being of seafarers and all others who depend on the shipping industry for a living are protected in this push towards net zero at sea? Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I now recognize Albania by video.
Distinguished delegates, it is an honor for Albania to be part of this important discussion to the human rights dimension of climate change and the need for just transition. Climate change is already damaging people's lives and rights, and those who have contributed the least are paying the highest price. Albania, like many other developing countries, emits little, yet we are already dealing with the consequences: disrupted agriculture and increased migration pressures. This is not just an environmental issue, it is a justice issue. The impacts of climate change are threatening the rights to water, health, housing, and livelihoods. These impacts fall mostly on those already vulnerable: women, children, and rural communities. Albania is acting, not because we are major polluters, but because we believe in responsibility and opportunity. But action without support won't get us far. Words of solidarity must translate into finance, technology, and real collaboration, especially for countries on the front line. Let's stop talking about just transition as theory. Let's make it reality for everyone. Thank you.
Merci. Je passe.
Thank you. I now speak to national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations and their list, and Earth Justice is the first speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the present context of the climate crisis, all states must take action to ensure a just transition away from the current fossil fuel-based economy. Considering the scale of impact of energy policies, states must guarantee opportunities for meaningful public participation and access to information during the policy-making process. For a future defossilized economy, states must adapt the traditionally fossil fuel power sector by removing barriers still preventing clean energy from entering the power grid. A just transition requires also to reduce the harms associated with the increase of critical mineral mining. States can adopt three policies: 1, more efficient standards to reduce mineral intensity; 2, leverage state spending to promote and deploy clean technologies that require fewer minerals; and 3, invest in public electric transport infrastructure. States can make more people move with fewer vehicles, making a more efficient use of critical minerals. Building more resilience and reducing the scale required to power the energy transition will lower environmental harm and human rights risk, particularly those associated with extractive industries. Thank you very much.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. Geneva pour les droits de l'homme is the next speaker.
On behalf of the Coalition Against Illegal Mining in the Amazon, I'm not here to accuse anyone, but to raise a warning flag. The Amazon is collapsing, and what is being destroyed is not a faraway ecosystem, but rather the possibility of actually living on Earth. The Amazon covers 7.6 million square kilometers. It brings 20% of the world's fresh water. It circulates water cycles and is a major carbon sink. Illegal mining for gold affects many Amazon countries and alters global climate. In Peru, in Madre de Dios, for example, deforestation due to mining has destroyed thousands of hectares and freed carbon, which has been stored for centuries. We have seen slash and burn, and in Bolivia, Colombia, and Ecuador, mercury is polluting water and the air. In Brazil, the Yanomami territory is being polluted by mercury, affecting many thousands of indigenous peoples. Climate degradation is a visible wound, and we're experiencing it. We have to respect the rights of indigenous peoples, otherwise there'll be no future, no climate or no future to protect.
Merci, je donne la parole à...
Thank you. Terre des Hommes now has a joint statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. I
I am representing the demands of girls and young women from She Leads. We would like to highlight that transitions in the context of climate change should address the needs of girls and young women, especially with regards to inclusive education. Climate change is affecting our income, our dreams, our health, and our future. Sudden climate disasters often lead to increased inequalities, especially when it comes to access to education. Take the example of 14-year-old Fatima from Ghana. She had to abandon school when floods destroyed her family's home. Her family could no longer afford school supplies. She now spends her days selling water on the roadside, risking harassment and exploitation, which creates mental health issues and gender disparity. Our call to action to member states is to ensure that not a single girl is stripped of her right to education by implementing policies that prioritize education for all, to provide more awareness about climate change and include climate education in school curricula, to ensure that communities impacted by climate change are compensated and can migrate safely and get equal opportunities to continue their education. We need bold and immediate actions truly leading to a transition for girls and young women. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Make Mothers.
Thank you. I recognize Make Mothers Matter video statement.
Mr. President, as we know, climate change exacerbates pre-existing inequalities, including gender inequalities. In particular, climate change increases the already disproportionate share of unpaid care work shouldered by women and girls. A just transition, therefore, cannot ignore care. It must explicitly recognize and address the disproportionate impact that climate change and environmental degradation have on the unpaid family care work undertaken by women, in particular mothers. Ignoring this dimension risks reproducing and deepening the very inequalities a just transition seeks to eliminate. We at Make Mothers Matter endorse the call from UNRISD and the Just Transition and Care Network to place care at the heart of climate and economic policies. A truly just transition must not only include care, it must be care-centered. This requires nothing less than a profound transformation of our economic and social systems. These must be redesigned to first serve the well-being of both people and the planet, uphold human rights, and embed equity, inclusion, and sustainability. Central to this transformation is the recognition and valuing of care work as fundamental to our economies and society. In other words, there can be no just transition without a shift from a careless to a careful economy. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to RSKS, also by video.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of RSKS working at the grassroots in India. Climate change is not only an environmental crisis, it is a human rights emergency. A just transition must go beyond policy rhetoric. It must be rooted in justice, equity, and local realities. At RSKS, we see the faces behind climate data: women farmers losing livelihoods to erratic rains, children missing school due to heat waves, and communities displaced by floods. Their voices must shape climate solutions. The imperative for a just transition is therefore paramount. This is not merely an environmental shift, but a fundamental restructuring of economies and societies grounded in human rights. A truly just transition must, Mr. President, we urge all states to center human rights in climate action, ensure inclusive green job creation, guarantee social protection for workers, and invest in education and climate resilience skills, especially for women and youth. Global commitments must translate into grassroots impact. Just transition must be gender responsive, community-led, and transparent. We call on this council to promote frameworks that bridge climate justice and human rights, enabling every person, not just the privileged, to thrive in a changing world. We thank you. May all live happily.
Merci. Je donne la parole à
Thank you. Association Paix now has the floor. In their absence, the India Worker Foundation has the floor by video.
Dear Mr. President, IWF since its inception has been vocal about people-first approach, and while drafting climate policies, climate change affects the poor because they are more dependent on climate-sensitive sectors like agriculture, fisheries, and forest-based livelihoods, and often lack the financial, social, and institutional means to cope with the climate shocks. The Government of India recognizes the need for inclusive climate resilience and has been taken several steps under the National Action Plan on Climate Change by promoting renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable agriculture, and water conservation. India integrates climate resilience with the employment for the rural through Manrega in rural areas. If small and marginal farmers face crop failures and income loss, programs like National Adaptation Funds for Climate Change aim to build resilience among them. To address urban vulnerabilities, the government has launched Climate Smart Cities program, increase the use of green infrastructure and strengthen disaster risk reduction mechanisms. It demonstrates a strong commitment to ensuring that development gains are not reserved and that resilience is built from the ground up where it means most. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. We have exhausted the second segment of the speakers list. Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, that was the last speaker we were able to listen to. I would like to recall that the delegates who were unable to speak the floor but were on the speakers list can upload their statements for them to be published on the extranet, given there was not time for them to speak. I would like to return to the panelists for their concluding comments. You have 3 minutes, maybe 3.5 minutes each. Ambassadors, you have 3 minutes 30. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have heard with enthusiasm the importance of CBDR and the need for an inclusive approach in order to promote just transition. And we believe that at COP30 in Belém, this will be an important platform for us to promote the just transition agenda and actually move from what was up to now negotiating process to the implementation of the commitments on climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building in line with the principles of the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and international human rights obligations. But Mr. President, I want to just concentrate on one issue that has not been sufficiently highlighted. There was a question about if we know the seriousness of the challenge, why are we not doing enough? And actually, that question was posed by late Pope Francis in 2015 and once again 2023. And the fact is, we are in a deficit of a moral and ethical reflection on what we need to do. And that's why Brazil is proposing in Belém also to take stock of this inability to move forward with the commitments that we have agreed and make sure that we implement them. We call that a global ethical stocktake, and we invite everyone of the global community to join us in what we call a mutirão. That is a word borrowed from the indigenous communities, and it means that everybody should work together towards a common purpose. We have this action agenda as a blueprint for our collective global effort and an initiative guided both by ethical, moral, and scientific imperative of just transition and equity. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you. Madam Kamen, you have the floor.
Jokultesia, distinguished panelists, excellencies, and delegates, I want to leave no doubt with you that Indigenous peoples want to be full partners with states in building real, just, and effective solutions to the climate crisis. Just transition is a central consideration as we seek such solutions, but it can't be a continuation of business as usual under a different name. It must prioritize a comprehensive transition away from the production and use of fossil fuels as an absolute requirement to uphold the global commitment to cap temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. It must also also include support for sustainable projects and activities that actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and do not cause further environmental destruction, including those being carried out by Indigenous peoples around the world. We affirm that just transition must center human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples as well as our time-tested knowledge and our full and effective participation. But we also need to collectively recognize that this is more than a political debate about whether respecting human rights might hinder economic profits from untested new technologies, carbon market projects, and destructive mineral mining carried out in the name of green energy. Please consider that the climate crisis requires that we choose a different path altogether, one that upholds our sacred responsibilities to each other, to our future generations, and to the natural world that we call Mother Earth. Please understand that survival is really what's at stake, yours and ours. Thank you again for listening to these words. Chokwe utesia, si imi en wayaim.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sigui?
Thank you, Mr. President. We got very useful insights from distinguished delegates and all the speakers, and there is a clear recognition of the imperatives of a just transition. And this is actually very important because in this very room in 2023, the International Labour Conference held a general discussion on just transition, which resulted in a resolution and very, very important conclusions that provide us with a very useful framework to pursue action globally, but also nationally. The framework on just transition that delegates adopted at the Labour Conference in 2023 make it clear that there is no single pathway to a just transition. Just transition depends on national context. It is not just about energy, it's about agriculture, food, transport systems. It's also important to note that these are all interconnected agendas: human rights, the climate agenda, decent work. So that is why we at the International Labour Office value highly our collaboration with the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights and all the work we do collectively at the technical level, but also engaging politically. And we highly appreciate your engagement also in the Global Coalition for Social Justice. There is certainly a greater need for policy coherence. The agenda on human rights, climate change, decent work means that our member states in ministries of labor, ministries in charge of foreign affairs, environment, development would need to guide us more in working together. And this is also what in the UN system we are doing, making our work more effective, more efficient, and being at your service in ways that also make many value for money and deliver more effectively. We're also very privileged to collaborate with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, currently chaired by Barbados, working closely with the SEEDs, the LDCs, and all countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change and where immense deficits for social work have to be addressed and which are being exacerbated by climate change. We very much look forward to engaging in COP30 under the Brazilian presidency and look forward, Ambassador, to your leadership. We already are working very closely with with our Brasilia office in the COP process in various fronts, and very much look forward to advancing this agenda at Belém. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Acheda.
Thank you so much for this really important exchange. I will take a few minutes to reply to the questions that the distinguished delegates from Iceland and Bangladesh asked about what are the steps and the pathways towards a just transition. First of all, we need to prioritize the actions that have the highest scientifically proven capacity to protect human rights of present and future generations now against the impacts of climate change. And as other speakers have already mentioned, that means prioritizing the phase out of fossil fuels. The second step is reviewing our assumptions and our models, and we have heard this time and again today. And this means asking whose needs are not being attended, whose needs are being prioritized, and who's benefiting from current models and who we're leaving behind. And I think there's a critical role there for national human rights institutions, for diverse knowledge holders, and that leads me to the third step, which is creating spaces for co-development of knowledge and solutions to the planetary crisis we're facing. And then being both domestically, locally, in international arena, like the climate COP, spaces where we think about fair partnerships and fair and equitable sharing of benefits and burdens from the just transition. And this entails mutual learning and entails maybe moving away from a one-way transfer of technology or of capacity, but rather moving towards processes of co-development of technology and mutual capacity building, where we think around what we're each learning from the lived experiences of the persons and human rights holders most affected by climate change, where we're learning from indigenous science, when we're learning from peasants and small-scale fishers' knowledge systems, where we're learning from children's innovation and inventiveness. I had the privilege of participating in the first global ethical stocktake, which happened in Europe, in London last week. And I felt hope, I felt inspiration. And I think that really proves how opening up those spaces for learning, for reflecting, for engaging with the science and the understanding of the impacts, speaking very clearly about where we're going wrong and where we don't have sufficient certainty that our efforts will bring us to a safer, to a clear pathway towards a safer climate is essential. And it is essential at every level, from the local level to national levels to international levels. And it is necessary in the climate COP, but it's also necessary in all multilateral environmental agreement spaces where we have opportunities and need for climate finance that's aligned with biodiversity, ocean, toxic pollution finance, taking more nexus approaches, and also in all international, including bilateral, free trade and investment agreements. As I said, these are currently some of the barriers to advancing on just transition, even where we may have provisions that in theory contribute. We actually need our overhaul of those areas of international law and really look looking at how those objectives of those areas of international law need to be explicitly and systematically geared towards effectively tackling the planetary crisis and putting all of us on a path towards a safer climate.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Ceci
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this round table. I would like to thank the High Commissioner and our distinguished panelists. I would like to thank everyone who has participated and contributed to our discussion. We will now have a brief pause before we start the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on climate change. Thank you.
Excellences, distingués collègues.
Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we will now begin the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the protection and promotion of human rights in the context of climate change. I have the pleasure of welcoming the mandate holder, Madame Elisa Morgera. The speakers list will be closed in 15 minutes, and I now would like to give the floor to the Special Rapporteur to present her report. Madame, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellency, distinguished delegates. We can still change course towards a safer climate, even despite having experienced the 10 hottest years in recorded history and having crossed the 1.5-degree global temperature in 2024. But states do need to prioritize actions that have the highest scientifically proven capacity to protect the human rights of present and future generations now in this decade. Today, I am honored to present my report on the imperative of defossilizing our economies to the Human Rights Council. My report clarifies that as a matter of existing international human rights obligations, states must urgently phase out fossil fuels, which are the main cause of climate change. And there has already been significant progress in decarbonizing the energy sector. But despite the recognition of the need for a fossil fuel phase-out in the international climate change regime and in the Pact for the Future, fossil fuel extraction and use are still increasing. My report also draws on biodiversity science and health science to reflect on how fossil fuels are at the core of all other planetary crises of biodiversity loss, toxic pollution, and economic inequalities. Through their full life cycle, fossil fuels have severe and widespread human rights impacts across generations and sectors. Fossil fuels are everywhere in our food systems, in our ocean, in our bodies, including in our brains, and in many cases without us knowing or choosing for them to be in our lives. They negatively impact on a range of human rights, from the point of exploration to that of waste management and decommissioning, further exacerbating climate change impacts. And human rights holders in the most vulnerable situations and facing multiple grounds of discrimination, including as a result of climate change, are bearing the brunt. This is the case of children, women, indigenous peoples, peasants, and small-scale fishers, among others. In my report, I recommend defossilization of our economies as a matter of international human rights obligations. This interpretation rests on the right to self-determination, the right to life and to live in dignity, and the obligation to prevent discrimination. It also rests on the obligation to ensure maximum available resources for the full realization of human rights. In fact, defossilization should be understood as an essential precondition for the right to development, which supports the right to self-determination and intergenerational equity. The right to development must be fully aligned with all substantive dimensions of the human right to a healthy environment, with a view to effectively tackling the planetary crisis we are facing and reducing poverty, including energy poverty and economic inequalities. In other words, defossilization is a precondition for the emergence of healthier development models for people and the planet, at the nexus of climate, nature, water, food, and health. So what does defossilization mean? It entails prioritizing the phase-out of fossil fuels, including various forms of financing them within and beyond the energy sector. It means recognizing and prioritizing the phase out of fossil fuels as the single most impactful health contribution. Defossilization underscores the need to focus on fossil fuels, also in connection with the growing production of plastics and petrochemicals, which cause an additional layer of human rights harms and further diminish nature's contribution to climate regulation and human resilience. Defossilizing our economies then means tackling all the financial benefits the fossil fuel companies are still gaining, effectively taxing exorbitant profits, phasing out subsidies, particularly those captured by high-income consumers and producers, preventing tax avoidance, and tackling the undue protection of fossil fuel companies under international investment law. And this is also about requiring fossil fuel companies to finance in fact, those harms amount to serious and substantial and for its unwavering international leadership on climate action, which benefits everyone's human right to a healthy environment. My visit to Vanuatu focused on intersectionality, recommending action that ensures that children, women and girls, LGBTQIA+ persons are not left behind in the context of climate change. And I developed a series of recommendations to the international community, the UN system, and other international partners and bilateral donors in that context, given the Vanuatu makes a negligible contribution to climate change and is one of the countries most vulnerable to it. Those recommendations focus on the urgent need to make progress on climate mitigation, and notably the phasing out of fossil fuels, and to ensure the international cooperation is proportionate to the harm caused and responsive to locally and culturally grounded needs and approaches. In concluding my statement, I just wish to share that I'm aware of the current geopolitical context and the difficulties that the implementation of my recommendations may face. But I would like to stress that defossilization action can and should take place immediately at any level, recognizing and supporting bottom-up, community-led, city-led and subnational initiatives can help explore pilot approaches and facilitate mutual learning across levels and knowledge system. We can nourish hope and share concrete learnings that can inspire a course correction within the current decade towards a safer climate for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pursuant to standard practice, we will begin by hearing from the delegations of the countries concerned. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vanuatu. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. First and foremost, we express our appreciation to the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, Ms. Elisa Mokera, for her engagement with our people and institutions during a visit to Vanuatu from the 27th to the 5th of December 2024, and for the attention given to the very real and urgent challenges our country faces as one of the utmost and most climate vulnerable nations in the world. The government of Vanuatu remains deeply committed to positive and constructive engagement with the UN human rights system. We believe the engagement and local realities in Vanuatu towards a more civil of vulnerable group must take into account a culture including climate change impacts, reflect those contexts national context. We welcome the report's call for increased international support for seeds, including improved access to finance, recognition of loss and damage, and strengthened technical cooperation. They are not merely policy priorities, they are matters of survival and justice of our people. We affirm our leadership in global climate advocacy, including our role in initiating the recent request for advisory opinion for the International Court of Justice, the obligation of states regarding climate change and human rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, Vanuatu stands in solidarity with all people affected by climate crisis. We believe that climate action must be rooted in principles of justice, inclusivity, and the respect for sovereignty, culture, and values of each nation. We thank the Special Rapporteur once again for a visit and engagement, and we look forward to continued dialogue and cooperation in the spirit of mutual respect and shared responsibility. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. La liste.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed. I would like to invite interested delegations to ask questions or comment on the report. I would remind you that the speaking time is limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds for each speaker. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal on behalf of a group of states.
Honor of speaking on behalf of the European Union Med-9 countries. We thank the Special Rapporteur for a report and reaffirm our support to her mandate. The Mediterranean is warming at a rate 20% faster than the global average, which contributes to the increase of extreme weather events. This is being felt across the region, putting pressure on ecosystems, biodiversity, and freshwater availability. Sea levels are rising, affecting coastal populations. Extreme climate events threaten the full enjoyment of human rights, including the right to a clean, safe, and sustainable environment for our and future generations, and the rights to water and food, which may increase forced displacements and deepen existing vulnerabilities. Our Ocean Conference in Athens emphasized the role of women and youth and climate change adaptation. And the UNOC Conference in Nice, at the UN Conference in Nice, environment ministers of the Mediterranean countries adopted a declaration that includes a commitment to work together towards the adoption of an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution and to support the Mediterranean circular economy network. The MEN 9 recognizes the interconnection between climate change and human rights. We must commit to ensuring a human rights-based approach to climate resilience and adaptation. We commend this Council's effort to contribute to global processes such as the UN Water Conference or COP30. FTF4 inaugurate today in Seville.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. The EU thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report on the imperative of transitioning away from fossil fuels. It rightly highlights the impacts of the fossil fuels through their life cycle on human rights. It is important to remain vocal about the human rights implications of fossil fuel use, particularly in the context of climate change. In this regard, the EU is actively engaged in discussions on advancing the human right to clean, healthy and sustainable environment. We remain committed to ensuring a just transition that is effective, human rights based and transformative. Moreover, we are actively working towards phasing out as soon as possible fossil fuel subsidies which do not address energy poverty or just transition. This includes identifying which subsidies to phase out, determining how to redirect resulting savings to decarbonization efforts and ensure adequate support for those in vulnerable situations. Madam Special Rapporteur, we appreciate the detailed recommendations of your report addressing various categories of stakeholders. With regard to the recommendation to amend investment treaties and contracts, what realistic timeline do you project for this work to ensure that the human rights impacts of all affected human rights holders are appropriately assessed? I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia on behalf of the group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Austria, Croatia, and my own country, Slovenia. We are in alignment with the statement of the EU. Madam Special Rapporteur, we commend your report, which clarifies our obligations to phase out fossil fuels within this decade. We endorse its imperative, given intergenerational human rights impacts across the fossil fuel life cycle. Urgent defossilization of our economies is needed for a human rights-based and transformative transition, protecting climate, nature, water, and food systems. Slovenia advances this via its national energy and climate plan, prioritizing vulnerable groups in the Alps and Adriatic. Austria emphasizes its Renewable Energy Expansion Act and developed a Just Transition Action Plan focusing on training
that climate change necessitates urgent and concerted action. The African Union is implementing the 2022 to 2032 Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan. This initiative aims to define a continental framework for collective action on climate change. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain on behalf of the group of Arab states.
What can I say? Thank you, Mr. President. President, the Arab Group has taken note of the report of the Special Rapporteur titled "The Imperative of Defossilizing Our Economies." We express our deepest concern over the continued negative impact of climate change on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights around the globe. We wish to recall that the fossil fuel is not only a source of energy, rather it is in most cases the economic backbone of the state institutions of developing countries. Breaking this backbone abruptly can have negative impacts on the ability of states to realize human rights. And it also has negative impacts on the economic and social rights. A one-size-fits-all model runs counter to the concept of just transition. In this respect, we wish to reaffirm that advanced countries must rise up to its responsibilities to finance global action in the LDCs and developing countries. Any discussion on climate action must be based on the historical responsibility of states and the common but differentiated responsibilities. In conclusion, we wish to reaffirm that collective solutions must be reached at to address climate change based on providing financial assistance and technology transfer to developing countries, as well as operationalizing the loss and damage fund. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait on behalf of the GCC.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تعرف دول مجلس التعاون على
Thank you, President. The GCC countries express their concern relating to excessive use of fossil fuels without bearing in mind development needs, especially in countries of the South. The GCC wishes to restate that progress towards defossilization must be realistic and progressive. It is essential to remember the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and national capacities. It is essential for the specific situation and capacity of each country be taken into account. The Council, the Human Rights Council, we would remind, has not yet got the capacity to issue climate-related recommendations. It is important to remember that we need real cooperation, sincere cooperation through transfer of technology, for example, which focuses on goals based on cooperation, not division. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Maldives on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of an informal group of SIDS as listed on the extranet. We welcome the thematic focus of the Special Rapporteurs report, which affirms the profound human rights implications of fossil fuel production. We are deeply alarmed by the continued expansion of fossil fuel production, despite overwhelming scientific evidence and decades of lived experience with climate change. Our islands, contributing less than 1% of global emissions, bear the gravest consequences, from the loss of livelihoods and public health crises to escalating cost of climate-induced disasters. The Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS reaffirms that climate change remains the single greatest threat to our sustainable development. The recently adopted WHO Climate Change and Health Action Plan further highlights the urgent health risks posed by climate change, particularly for vulnerable states. We therefore strongly support the Special Rapporteur's call for a just, rights-based transition. This requires the full operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund and scaled-up accessible finance in line with COP29 outcomes. We urge all states, particularly major emitters, to commit to a fair, equitable phase-out of fossil fuels in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal and the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria, Canada, Colombia, Cyprus, Finland, France, Germany, the Marshall Islands, the Netherlands, Panama, and the United Kingdom thank the Special Rapporteur for her report. Climate change and environmental degradation pose a risk to the lives and well-being of individuals and communities across the world, especially the most marginalized. This is compounded by the impacts of the fossil fuel cycle. 3.5 billion people now live in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. Rapid and enduring action must be taken to safeguard the full enjoyment of human rights for individuals now and in the future. As per the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement adopted at COP28, advancing the transition away from fossil fuels is crucial. It deserves mention in this session's Human Rights and Climate Change resolution. We will continue to demonstrate leadership, including through the Global Clean Power Alliance initiative and our ambitious and credible 2035 NDC targets. Environmental defenders and indigenous peoples are vital stewards of nature. We support their meaningful participation and leadership in climate action. Special Rapporteur, what more can states do to build global consensus and advance the transition away from fossil fuels? Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka welcomes a report of the Special Rapporteur highlighting the need to phase out fossil fuels as a being key factor in addressing climate change. Climate change is becoming more and more visible, while the climate crisis is affecting millions, including the unborn children. Sri Lanka is highly vulnerable to climate change and is constantly at risk of extreme weather events and disasters. Sri Lanka is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions despite having a relatively low carbon footprint. Sri Lanka envisages developing indigenous renewable energy resources to generate 70% of the power by 2030 and becoming a carbon net zero by 2050. Mr. President, the government's national policy framework is committed to adapting policies to save the environment for future generations and has identified several key activities, including polluters pay principle, decrease reliance on oil for electricity production by prioritizing renewable and clean energy sources, systematically shift the transport sector using clean energy, and more. It is our collective responsibility to shift from traditional fossil fuel-based energy resources to green and renewable resources to save our children and the planet. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la
Thank you. I recognize the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Kenya n'est pas en salle. Je donne la...
Absent. I therefore recognize Panama.
Gracias, señor. Thank you, President. We wish to thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of her thematic report. It is undeniable that an economy driven by fossil fuels is the main cause of the climate crisis. The IPCC has found this. It drives biodiversity loss, plastics pollution, and harmful petrochemical production. OHCHR, special procedures, and the treaty bodies for years have been documenting the repercussions of fossil fuel life cycle on human rights and on the environment, and they've been focusing on the international obligations of states. The Paris Agreement and the advisory opinion of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea very clearly establish the legal obligation to gradually abandon fossil fuels and their subsidies. It is essential for those economies based on this sector to be accountable for the damage they've caused on others and their contribution to global warming. We can't accept more excuses. There must be effective changing climate action based on human rights in order to defossilize economies so we can bring about a just transition, protect humanity and nature, given the global crises we face. To conclude, just like the High Commissioner, we note with interest the increased support for a new non-proliferation of fossil fuels treaty. Thank you.
Merci.
I thank you and give the floor to the UNDP.
Mr. President, UNDP welcomes the work of the Special Rapporteur to phase out fossil fuels and is committed to finding human rights-based solutions to phasing out fossil fuels. Firstly, UNDP's Energy Moonshot aims to provide 500 million people access to sustainable energy. Our Solar for Health initiative under our Smart Health Systems program has supported the solar electrification of over 1,000 health centers in 28 countries, including South Sudan, Yemen, and Nepal. Guiding these efforts, UNDP published a report to guide countries on implementing fossil fuel subsidy reforms. Secondly, UNDP is working in 47 countries on business and human rights, and in 2024 published a tool for business to respect human rights in the context of climate change. In Thailand, Kazakhstan, and Malawi, we have supported the integration of the environment into human rights due diligence processes. Thirdly, we welcome the recommendation of the Special Rapporteur for UNDP to support defossilization in NDCs. As the largest provider of assistance to NDCs, working with 118 countries, we are supporting governments to meet their commitment under the Paris Agreement through NDCs 3.0. UNDP is committed to delivering concrete actions and support to countries on their defossilization journey, and we look forward to increased cooperation with all actors in this regard. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée
Thank you. I recognize the Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of the Marshall Islands thanks the Special Rapporteur for presenting her report after her visit to our Pacific friend and ally, Vanuatu, and her insightful consideration of the unique vulnerabilities of our Pacific region. We take this opportunity to commend her thematic report on the need to urgently defossilize our economies. The report is alarming, especially for a country like mine, which has contributed so little to climate change, but now relies on the actions of others. Making commitments can be easy. Following through with them can be more difficult. Indeed, even after we agreed in the UNFCCC to transition away from fossil fuels, the same countries continue to extract and use more than ever before. Even though existing fossil fuel infrastructure alone would deliver more emissions than a 1.5-degree pathway can tolerate, countries continue to build new infrastructure, new wells, mines, power plants, export facilities. Even while we struggle to raise the finance needed to respond to climate change, the world is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry in $400 billion per year. We fully support the report's findings on the need for all states to immediately start defossilization plans and measures. How does the Special Rapporteur see her report helping us move beyond unfulfilled promises to real action? Komal Dada, and I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Special Rapporteur for presenting a detailed report on the defossilization of global economies and roles of states and business entities in this regard. We take note of the recommendations and conclusions of her report. Being one of the most climate vulnerable countries, Bangladesh attaches enormous importance to combating the adverse impacts of climate change. We have developed our National Adaptation Plan and our second nationally determined contribution with ambitious CO2 emission reduction target is under process. Besides, integration of mitigation and adaptation into a resilient to prosperity trajectory with emphasis on locally led solutions and nature-based approaches has been prioritized in the Bangladesh Climate Prosperity Plan. Mr. President, we subscribe that the pervasive use of plastics in agri-food systems and food value chains has caused water and soil pollution, exacerbating impacts of climate change. We need to have a deeper look into this. We request the Special Rapporteur's reflection on two issues: prioritizing reparations, compensations, and remedies for historical climate harm, and investor-state dispute settlement in this regard. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
I thank you and recognize the Dominican Republic.
Thank you very much, President. Climate change is a direct threat to a decent life. We see natural disasters such as droughts, flood, and these affect housing, security, food, especially for the most vulnerable countries. These impacts are not abstract. They lead to displacement, hunger, diseases, and privation that really erode the economic and social achievements that we've brought about with such difficulty. As a small island developing states, we're experiencing this on a daily basis. This is why proposing and moving towards a just transition is not an option. It is an absolute need. We have a rights-based climate strategy and a national development strategy, and we have an NDC based on adaptation and resilience. But no country can do this alone. We need a global environment with solidarity. We need financing, access to clean technology, and effective cooperation. We support the Council and the Rapporteur to continue to focus on climate issues in all debates. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the Mauritius.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
This expresses appreciation to Madame la Rapporteure for the presentation of a report. Mauritius has taken good note of all the recommendations contained therein. Monsieur le Président, Mauritius remains committed to a resilient and carbon-neutral economy. In 2020, Mauritius has enacted the Climate Change Act to harmonize efforts for climate action and now is implementing a just transition framework. However, challenges persist. We therefore call for aligning just transition pathways with processes like the SDGs Sendai framework and Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The adoption of a clear and comprehensive framework to achieve just transition targets in a just and human rights-based manner. A human rights and an environmental due diligence in the design, financing, implementation of just transition programs, including a gender-responsive approach. And finally, the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and tax exemptions in a responsible manner that leaves no one behind. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Je donne la...
I thank you and recognize Samoa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Samoa remains deeply concerned at the worsening state of the climate crisis, in which the 1.5-degree goal is off track, as states regress from their climate commitments. We welcome the Special Rapporteur's thematic report highlighting the linkages between international human rights obligations and fossil fuels, in addition to biodiversity loss and plastic pollution, all of which produces harmful intergenerational impacts. The climate crisis continues to wreak havoc on our livelihoods, food security, health, and culture. Hence, the phasing out of fossil fuels is critical to all our survival. We commend Vanuatu on its community-based climate resilience projects and international leadership in shaping global climate action, and encourage continued dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the divergent views on the characterization of vulnerable groups, all of which should be based on love and respect. Mr. President, decisive climate action is needed, which is why Samoa has joined the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, calling for a new multilateral instrument to complement the Paris Agreement that would govern the supply of fossil fuel. Moreover, as we approach the final stages of the INC process, we must ensure ambitious actions across the full cycle of plastics in the agreement. We therefore ask the Special Rapporteur, how can we address the energy and infrastructure gaps that prevent those disproportionately affected by climate change, including SIDS, from benefiting equitably from the renewable energy transition? I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée.
Thank you. I now recognize the distinguished representative of the Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. Maldives thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report, which clarifies states' international human rights obligations and businesses' responsibilities to phase out fossil fuels within this decade. As a small island developing state confronting the daily lived realities of climate-induced threats, we resonate deeply with the Special Rapporteur's observations that the world's dependence on fossil fuels must be reduced for the severity of its impacts on a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Mr. President, the Maldives' third nationally determined contribution charts a clear path to reduce emissions, targeting 33% renewable energy generation and promoting energy-efficient renewable technologies across all sectors. Further, it emphasizes that a just transition must be inclusive, adopting gender-responsive strategies to empower women and also encourage vulnerable groups to actively participate in the shift to renewable energy. We urge the international community to reinforce its commitment to accelerate the transition to renewable energy by phasing out fossil fuels. This is essential to redress multiple inequitable burdens borne by SIDS as well as communities, individuals disproportionately affected by climate change. It is also a critical step towards a just transition that ensures a safe and sustainable environment for future generations. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué.
Thank you. I now recognize Nepal.
Mr. President, Nepal thanks the Special Rapporteur for presenting the report on the imperative of defossilizing the economies. The report rightly underscores the need to phase out fossil fuels, which are the main cause of climate change and a driver of multiple planetary crises, biodiversity loss, toxic pollution, inequalities, and human rights violations. The continued use of fossil fuels undermines the ability of both present and future generations to fully and freely enjoy their human rights. The Constitution of Nepal guarantees every person the right to live in a healthy and clean environment as a fundamental right. The 16th Plan 2025-2029 prioritizes a smooth and just transition from fossil fuels to clean and green energy sources. The government of Nepal hosted the first episode of Sagarmatha Samvad, meaning Mount Everest Dialogue, a multi-stakeholder forum held in Kathmandu in May this year under the theme Climate Change, Mountains, and the Future of Humanity. The dialogue highlighted the need to increase the use of clean energy for a just transition. Phasing out fossil fuel is essential for effective climate action today. In this regard, we would like to hear from the Special Rapporteur, how can climate vulnerable and mountain economies effectively ensure human rights-based energy transitions? Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I recognize the Bahamas.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Special Rapporteur for her urgent and timely report. The Bahamas aligns with the call for rapid defossilization. As Prime Minister Davis recently noted, small island developing states like ours are on the front lines of a crisis not of our making. Despite contributing minimally to global emissions, SIDS suffer disproportionately from sea level rise, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. This is a grave injustice that threatens, among others, the right to life and the right to development for present and future generations. We echo the call for a just human rights-based transition and welcome the Special Rapporteur's recognition of fossil fuels as the root cause of the climate crisis. In this regard, the Bahamas has endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, advocating for an end to fossil fuel expansion and a fair transition to renewable energy. And we have recently become a state party to the Escazú Agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. We call upon states and private actors to commit to rapid emissions reductions, equitably scale up finance for adaptation and loss and damage, and uphold the principle that polluters must pay their fair share. We urge all states to act with resolve and in solidarity to protect the most vulnerable. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I now recognize Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur for her compelling report on the imperative to defossilize our economies. We fully agree that phasing out fossil fuel dependence is an essential component of holistic climate action and the transition towards a carbon-neutral economy. This transition needs to be just and take into account human rights. Therefore, Germany has committed to phasing out coal domestically by 2038, supported by substantial public investment in revitalizing coal-dependent regions and minimizing negative impacts on workers and communities. We are investing in renewable energy,
hydrogen infrastructure, and reskilling programs to ensure communities are empowered, not abandoned by the transition. Internationally, we place human rights at the core of our climate cooperation. Through our International Climate Initiative, we've supported more than 1,000 climate and biodiversity projects across more than 150 countries, providing almost 7.5 billion euros of funding. Additionally, Germany is a committed partner of the Climate Club and the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, supporting clean energy development while safeguarding livelihoods and supporting democratic participation. Madam Special Rapporteur, what are the most effective ways to ensure that people and communities, especially those most vulnerable, can meaningfully shape national just transition strategies? Thank you.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Thank you. I now recognize Vietnam.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Vietnam remercie la...
Thank you, President. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for presenting the report. As a country heavily exposed to the effects of climate change, we are firmly committed to a just, inclusive energy transition. We are aiming at carbon neutrality by 2050, and we are putting in place initiatives such as on methane and forest. We believe that economic growth should not compromise the environment, adaptation for the climate, the protection of the environment at the very heart of our actions. In parallel, we are shoring up social commitments, notably in fossil fuels, modernizing infrastructure and improving energy efficiency. However, this transition also requires greater international assistance, the transfer of technologies, financing, and capacity building. Madam Special Rapporteur, what mechanisms of international cooperation are the most effective to support developing countries in this just transition? Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malta aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks Special Rapporteur Morgara for her timely report. Indeed, the use of fossil fuels remains a major item in the fight against climate change, in particular increasing temperatures, sea level rises, and increasingly extreme temperatures. We echo the call for urgent science-based action to phase out fossil fuels within this decade, and we underline that this transition must be equitable and grounded in international human rights law. As a small island state, Malta understands the existential threat posed by rising temperatures and sea levels and has set a target to increase its renewable energy to renewable share to 25% by 2030, aiming to reduce reliance on fossil fuels in its current energy mix. We also remain committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050. Furthermore, Malta is exploring offshore wind and solar power, particularly through floating technologies suitable for its geographic condition, also because of the very limited land territory, which presents its own specific challenges. I thank you.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. President. Despite the severe climatic challenges, environmental challenges including scarcity of water and sandstorms, the government of Iraq has taken ambitious steps to address the national responses through the national climate plans, as well as expanding the use of renewable energy and rolling out renewable energy projects in all sectors. However, a balanced approach must be taken, adopting the different levels of development among countries. Phasing out of fossil fuels must not be realized without balanced and just alternatives. We express our observations in the report, like the net zero emissions. We believe that the just transition is the most important solutions out. Thank you.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
Mr. President, we regret that the Special Rapporteur has not adhered to her mandate, the recommendations in the report which call indiscriminately upon all countries to abandon fossil fuels, fail entirely to consider the importance of ensuring that just transition policies take into account development priorities and the differing national circumstances of states. It also disregards the right of developing countries to pursue the maximum potential for development similar to the developed countries. We express our dismay at the superficial treatment of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. This principle clearly establishes that while all countries share collective responsibilities to address climate change, developed countries bear a greater historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. They possess financial and technological capacities far superior to those available to developing countries. Therefore, developing countries must be granted flexibility in the nature of their just transitions, along with the necessary support through financing and technology transfer. In conclusion, the report treats the abandonment of natural resources as a secondary matter, whereas for many developing countries it is an existential issue. The extraction and utilization of these resources is not a luxury. It is the principal means by which countries lift themselves out of poverty, guarantee the fundamental rights of their citizens, and build resilient societies capable of withstanding crises. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, climate change driven by fossil fuels is already causing more frequent disasters, displacing communities, disrupting agri-food systems, and worsening hunger. We join the call to phase out coal, oil, and gas, and fossil fuel subsidies within this decade through a just transition that protects both people and the planet. Equitably transforming agri-food systems is essential to this effort. We can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in agri-food systems by replacing fossil-based inputs with bio-based alternatives and by transitioning to renewable energy. We can also improve carbon sequestration in agri-food systems by using ecosystem and nature-based approaches. Such steps reduce global warming, lower pollution, and strengthen resilience in food systems. Finally, the very survival of small island development states, indigenous people, peasants, and small-scale fishers is jeopardized by climate-driven loss of land and livelihoods. The defossilization of our economies must be people-centered and guided by principles of justice and equity, and the FAO will continue to support policies and actions that uphold rights, knowledge, and food security as part of a rights-based climate response.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Distinguished Representative of Mali. Thank you, President. We align ourselves with the statement by the Africa Group, and we thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of the report. My delegation remains concerned by the failure to reinforce human rights. We have seen the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change, the Kyoto Protocol. However, the climate continues to be degraded by greenhouse gas emissions, pollution of petrochemicals and pollutions. In Mali, climate change has a direct impact which heavily affects the pillar of the local and national economy, agriculture. We have seen droughts, exhaustion of soils and floods, as well as an increase of number of vulnerable people over the past 50 years. Mali is a member of international treaties and has received subsidies. However, we need greater funding and technical support to protect ourselves from the shock of climate change. Thank you. I now give the floor to the OIC.
OIC en salle, s'il vous plaît.
Are they in the room? You have the floor.
Mr. President, on behalf of the OIC Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission, I thank the Special Rapporteur for her comprehensive report and reiterate that climate change is not only an environmental crisis, but also pressing human rights concern with disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations. Indeed, the adverse effects of climate change undermine the enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, especially the rights to life, health, food, water, and adequate housing. This burden falls mostly heavily on developing countries,
particularly in the OIC region. Despite contributing the least to global emissions, the communities in the OIC region face desertification, rising sea levels, water scarcity, and loss of livelihoods. In line with its mandate, the IPHRC underscores the principle of climate justice, urging all stakeholders to uphold their human rights obligations in climate action. This includes providing adequate support for adaptation, resilience, and just transition in developing countries through fair financing and technology transfer. The Commission also calls for stronger inclusion of indigenous peoples, women, youth, and climate-displaced persons in decision-making to ensure that no one is left behind. We reaffirm our commitment to work with the Special Rapporteur and other partners to promote human rights-based climate action that is equitable.
UNESCO,
please.
Thank you, Mr. President. UNESCO commends the Special Rapporteur for placing human rights at the core of climate action. The right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment underpins all other rights. Through our mandates in science, education, and culture, UNESCO supports member states in protecting people and planets. Our World Heritage Sites, biosphere reserves, and indigenous knowledge networks foster resilience and innovation. We advance education for sustainable development and open science, empowering communities to anticipate, adapt, and act. But ambition must meet urgency. We call for greater investment in climate-informed education, ethical AI, and inclusive early warning systems. UNESCO stands ready to collaborate on solutions rooted in equity and dignity. Thank you.
Merci. Ceci était la...
Thank you. That was the last statement that we are able to listen to during this meeting. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, we have come to the end of this meeting and we will meet at 1500 hours this afternoon to continue the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on climate change, followed by the report of the Forum on Business and Human Rights, and we will start to adopt the final document of the UPR. I declare closed this current session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you and bon appétit.
Thank you.